And now it's time to preview an upcoming game with Ryan Metzler.
Hey everybody, it's Ryan Metzler here again, and today we're going to take a look at another Dice Tower preview. This time we're going to take a look at Castle Assault by TJ Dunbar. Now this is a game for 1 or 2 players, in which each player controls their own faction, which is composed of a deck of cards, and they're trying to use that faction to bring them into their castle, rush them out of their castle onto the battlefield, fight their opponent's faction, and hopefully overrun that faction in order to get to their opponent's castle and destroy the castle before their opponent can, of course, destroy theirs. So real quick, why don't we take a look at what you're going to get inside of this box with a quick reminder that these are prototype, not final quality components. We'll see how the game plays, and then we'll come back here and I'll sum it all up for you at the end. So here we can see the components for Castle Assault all laid out. Now, as I talked about, there are several different faction decks you can play in this game. Each player gets their own faction, and right now I'm showing 4 of them. We have a vampire faction where you have things like hemogoblins, you have lord vampires and sanguine elves, and all types of very different things, vessel acolytes, and all of these are going to have their different abilities on them. In addition, in each of these decks, you're going to have ability cards that you can play sometimes as instants, whenever you want, sometimes on your turn, and they're going to give you some type of benefit. For example, this one will heal a target unit out on the field for 2 lost health, returning them 2 health so that they can be damaged more and still survive. Now, these cards all have costs that are printed in the bottom left-hand corner. It costs 1 resource to play this, and you'll see more about what that means later, and it will give you this effect right here. The units in the game are not only going to have a cost in the bottom left-hand corner, in this case 4 units to play, but they're also going to have various statistics and some keywords as well as text that tells you what they do on them. For example, this one here says that he has 3 movement, 3 attack, 0 armor, and 4 health. So he will move 3 every turn when he moves, he will do 3 damage when he attacks, he absorbs no damage when he is attacked, and he can take up to 4 damage before he dies. In addition, this guy here has an ability called Resurrection that says that if one of your other units dies on the battlefield and doesn't already have a token on them, they are brought back to life wherever they are. They get a token placed on them, and the next time they die, they'll be gone permanently. So, each unit will have their own type of abilities. For example, another one here says that every round at the end of the turn, he loses 1 life. But he has a ranged ability where he can attack from a distance 1 to 6 spaces away, dealing his 4 damage and not getting a hit back by somebody else. In addition to this vampire faction, here I'm showing the elves, which are a little bit more of a ranged faction, attacking from afar, and also have the ability to move laterally, whereas most units are just going to move forward, rushing the opponent's castle. We also have the orc team here. They're a little bit faster. They're going to get out and do things immediately, and they are also going to have a benefit from this momentum track that you see out here, more so than other things. And then you have the wolves faction. The wolves are again also going to act a little bit faster than other guys, but they're also going to have the ability to call units out to them in the middle of the battlefield. Instead of always starting from a castle, sometimes they'll be able to pull guys out and start in the middle of the battlefield, having a better rush on their opponent's castle. Now, this board out here represents that battlefield and the 2 opposing castles in the game. Each player has a castle represented by this strip over here of 3 spaces, 1, 2, 3. And their opponent will be directly opposite in these 3 spaces. In between those spaces is the battlefield, and this will be the area that these players are traversing in order to reach their opponent's castle and try and deal damage to it in order to win the game. The first player dealing 10 damage to their opponent's castle being the winner. Now, how the game is going to play is each player is going to have their deck of cards. There are pre-made starter decks, but you can customize these decks by including or removing specific units, or even adding some of the factionless cards that will be included with the game. For example, this one here is factionless, costs 3 to play. It says target unit gains the expand ability, which will allow them to essentially put oozes out on the board, kind of clones that unit in that area. Or we could have one that says turning the tide, which will allow them to adjust the momentum of the battle, which you'll see in just a moment. But each player will have built or will be using one of the basic decks. And these decks will be shuffled and placed in front of that player, each player drawing 5 cards for the start of the game. So real quick, we'll set that up. Once each player has their starting hand of 5 cards, you're going to determine who will be the first player, and you can do this with a simple die roll. In this case, we have a tie, so we would re-roll, and we'll see that our player on my right, your left, is going to be the first player. that player is going to start by taking their turn, and each turn is broken down into several phases, the first being the start of turn phase. At the start of turn phase, the first thing you will do on every turn is roll a die for momentum, and this momentum starts neutrally, but you're going to roll a die and move the momentum that many spaces in your direction. So for example, 3, and I would move 1, 2, 3 spaces in my direction. If this momentum ever reaches the extreme on either side, that player is going to get a bonus of +1 attack when they're charging an opponent. So they're going to want to have the momentum on their side for the battle, and when they're charging their opponents, they'll get a little bit stronger attack. After they've done this, the next thing they're going to do is ready their resources. Now, right now, we don't have any resources, but throughout the game, players will be able to play any card in their hand down to the table face down as a resource to be used in the game. And what they'll be doing is they'll be exhausting these resources in order to play units out to the table according to the cost of the unit in the bottom right hand or bottom left hand corner, like this one here. 3 units in order to, or 3 resources in order to play that unit. Once they've readied all of their resources, meaning making them available for use again, you're going to move on to drawing a card, and they're going to take the top card of their deck and add it, of course, to their hand. Once they've done with this, there's going to be certain cards that have start of turn effect, and you'll check to see if any of your cards have the words at the start of the turn on these cards and activate those effects at this point. Those are not mandatory unless they say that they are. Finally, you're going to move on to moving units, and each unit, once it's in your castle area or anywhere out on the board, is going to have a movement value. You can see right here that the Bloodhound has a movement value of 1. It's always this top green number. If this unit were already out in my castle, he must move forward 1 space, or if he were anywhere out on the battlefield from the previous turns, he would move forward 1 space automatically if he's able to do so. So this, again, is not an optional movement. Once you've completed these steps of the start of turn phase, you're going to move into the open phase, and this is a little bit more of a free-form type of phase where you can do multiple different things in various different orders. Now, the first thing you can always do, or at any point on your turn, is you can play, as I said, any card face down as a resource. This is going to be a card that you think you don't need, or a card that you think is going to be less valuable at this point in the game. And you would play it face down as a resource off of the board in order to be used to play other cards. Let's say, for example, that I don't think I need this ability right now, which allows me to heal 2 damage to one of my damaged units. I would place him down, face down, to be used as a resource. Other things I can do are playing units from my hand. Now, in order to play units from my hand, I must exhaust a number of resources equal to their costs. The Bloodhound here is a good example. He costs 1 resource, and I've played 1 resource to the table for my turn. So I could exhaust this resource and play the Bloodhound out to my castle area. All units come out into the castle area, and so you must have an open spot there in order to play your unit. Let's say that I decided I wanted to play him right here. He is now here, and starting with the next turn, he'll be able to move forward, and he'll be able to take actions. The third type of thing you can do is play abilities. Now, I discarded my ability, and I wouldn't have had a target for it anyway, but abilities are not units. You'll see they don't have movement, attack, armor class, or life, but they are able to be played and target another unit in play. So if I had had another unit in play, I could have paid 1 resource in order to target that unit, and if it had taken damage, healed 2 damage from that unit in order to restore it some of its life. Another thing you can do is, of course, take unit actions, but in order for a unit to take actions, it has to have been out on the field since the start of your turn. So, since this unit came out this turn, I cannot take any actions with it, but starting next turn, he'll be able to take some actions. Since our first player is pretty much done with their turn, the next player would then take their turn in much the same fashion, except for in this game, the second player on their first turn can play 2 resources instead of the usual 1. So they could have 2 cards face down in order to use to bring other units or abilities into play. We're going to go ahead and take several turns advancing the game, and then we will show you some of the other options of what units can do as actions on their turn and how combat will take place. So now we've just kind of simulated a board state moving forward a little bit. These have not been actual turns, but instead we've just kind of got some units out on the field in order to show you what might happen when specific units move. So right now we're going to say it's the beginning of the second player's turn. They have the units that they have out on the field here. So they have a guy that's kind of a couple spaces up. He's been out for a turn, at least 1 full turn. We have some units in the backfield here with 0 movement, and essentially they're going to start by taking their turn. So the first thing they're always going to do is they're going to roll their momentum. We can see the momentum is currently a little bit in their favor, but we're going to see where it goes. It goes all the way to their favor, which will give them +1 attack if they have a charge. So that's good for them. Now, at that point, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with the next step of the turn, which is readying their resources. So they could take all of their resources and ready them again, now able to be used to bring more units into play. Next, they would, of course, always draw a card. So drawing cards is good. And then they're going to move all of their units after doing their start of turn effects. So none of their guys out on the field have started turn effects, so they're going to start with moving their units. And they always must move the first unit in line first. Now, when they do this, they have to move it its full movement. In this case, that is 3. 1, 2, and they cannot move a third space because you can see that the Bloodhound is out in front of him. Now, the Bloodhound is still alive because on an earlier turn, the Sanguine Blade was played on him. At the end of every turn, the Bloodhound loses 1 life. But at the start of every turn, because of the blade, he gains 1 back. So it's just kind of a net of 0, losing 1 and gaining 1 at the end and start of every turn. We also have a dragon over here that loses a health at the end of every turn, so it should technically be down to 4 health, and next turn it would go down to 3. But it does have quite a bit of movement, a lot of attack, some defense, and has a decent amount of life. Now, once this monster advances up these 3 spaces, or the 2 that it's only able to, it's going to engage our Bloodhound here, and they're going to go into a combat. Now, because he cannot move his full movement, he's actually going to get a bonus to his attack. He's going to get a +1 bonus for moving forward with this attack, and he's going to be able to hit a little bit harder. This means that his attack is going to be 4, and that's going to look at the armor class of the defending Bloodhound, which is 0. So right now, 4 damage is going to go through. 4 minus 0 is 4. Likewise, the Bloodhound is going to deal damage back, and he has an attack of 3. The defense, or the armor class, of our elf here is 0, so he's going to deal 3 damage, and he only has a life of 1. So in this case, both units are going to be destroyed, and the cards are going to be returned to the discard piles of the respective players. When this happens, each player that managed to kill the opposing player's unit is going to draw 1 card and add it to their hand as a bonus for dealing fatal damage to a creature out on the board. Now after that, each of the other characters from this player must move forward, but you'll see they both have a movement of 0, so both of them are just going to stand in the castle defending that area. However, they do have the option of taking actions once we've finished with this starting phase, and we're going to move to the open phase. Actions that can be taken are still the same for the player. They can still place a resource, they can still play new characters or new units, they can still play abilities, and then each of their units on the field has the ability to do something as well. That would be taking a unit action, and these are all listed on the board as well. The unit actions they can take are first charging. If a unit wants, it can charge forward, and essentially this is a driven run towards the opponent's castle. When they do this, they're essentially going to declare that they're charging and roll a d6. They're then going to move that many spaces forward on the field. This is a way you can also declare an attack on somebody. If you were able to charge all the way up to them, you will then get an attack on them. When you charge, if you get extra movement, let's say that this guy right here charged and he moved 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces, he would have an extra movement he wouldn't be able to take, and he would get +1 to his attack. Likewise, since the momentum is totally in his favor, he would get an extra bonus to his attack. So if he were to charge 6, he would actually have a 7 attack instead of the normal 5. If you charge and you do not reach an opponent's character running into them, there will be no combat. In addition, if combat lasts for more than 1 round, there will be a second round of combat where damage is dealt likewise, except you won't get any bonuses from charges. So essentially, damage will carry over from the first to the second round of combat. Say, for example, that this character here were to deal their 5 damage, but 2 of it is negated by the AC, this guy would go down to 1, and a second round of combat would happen if he had not killed off our elf. But, unfortunately, the dragon would kill the elf, and the second round of combat would never happen. Instead of charging forward, you can use an ability on one of your guys. So you'll see that some of these cards have abilities that can be activated. For example, this elf here has an ability called Ranged Linear 1 to 5. Now that means that he can attack somebody within 5 spaces of him without having to move. So we can see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Unfortunately, he's not close enough on his own. But the unit standing next to him has an ability that says she has an aura, and adjacent friendly units within 2 squares gain +1 attack and +1 range. So, now his range is going to be up to 6. And we'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He's now within range. He can use his ability to make an attack at strength of 6. And when he does so, we'll see that 6 minus 2 is 4. He would deal 4 damage, the remaining damage, to our dragon, and remove him from the board, killing him off. And of course, drawing a card to add to his hand. Our other unit on the board has yet to do anything. Her aura helped out our other elf, but she hasn't charged, she hasn't used an ability, and she hasn't attacked or, of course, chosen to do nothing. So she could still charge forward, trying to run up on the opponent's castle, and she'd be able to move 5 spaces, running out and trying to reach the opponent in order to deal damage to their castle. More on that in just a moment. Instead, she could just stay back here and do nothing, or if she had already been in front of an opponent's unit, she doesn't need to charge in order to attack. She can simply attack without charging, but won't get any benefits of overrunning or the momentum on the board. Of course, we can also still play cards from our hand, and we've acquired several cards throughout this process of killing off different units on the board, so we could look through and see if there was anything we wanted to play into our castle, or using an ability, using our refreshed resources that we still have. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the objective is not to deal damage to your opponent's units, but rather to deal damage to their castle. And in order to do so, you're going to need to progress your units across the battlefield and stand in front of their castle. With this unit, you would have to do so by charging, because it does not have an inherent movement that will force it to happen every turn. With a unit like the dragon from the vampire side, it could theoretically advance each turn and progress across the field, forcing a movement into the castle at some point. And when this happened during that movement, it would automatically deal it 7 damage to the castle if there was no defending unit standing inside of this castle. So we could move immediately from 10 to 3 hit points left on our castle. Now, of course, we'd want to make sure this doesn't happen, because that's a lot of hit points to lose, and if this happens during the movement phase, he can again immediately attack the castle using his action in order to finish it off. You'll see that leaving your castle undefended is a very bad idea. However, if a unit were to be standing here, you can stop this by, of course, having combat between the unit inside the castle and the attacking unit standing in front of the castle. So the way to prevent this from happening is, of course, to get units out into your castle, have combat with the attacking units, and prevent them from dealing damage to the castle. Now, it can also be that you use your action to charge forward and deal damage to the castle. So after you've moved on your turn, charging forward and attacking the castle will let you deal damage. But unlike attacking another character, you don't get a second round, so it's just 1 round of damage dealt to the castle. In this manner, the first player who is able to keep units alive on the board, have them progress across the battlefield, and note that range damage cannot hit the castle, so you must progress across the board in order to deal damage, clear out units that are standing inside the castle, and deal 10 damage to their opponent's castle will be the winner. Now, in addition to the 2-player game where each player controls their own faction, defending their own castle, there's also a 1-player variant where, of course, the 1 player controls whatever faction they would like, and the other player in the game is controlled by an AI scenario programmed by the rulebook. There are several of these laid out in the rulebook, from mercenaries to oozes, with various different win conditions, and of course this runs itself. So you'll know that on turn 1, a specific type of monster is supposed to appear at a specific position in the castle. On turn 2, different monsters will appear in the castle, and certain monsters will advance according to their own abilities on their card, and will perform actions according to the abilities printed on the card. So you'll see that some of them, for example, the mercenary lieutenant here says it must use its action in order to charge. This will come out at a known point during the round based on what that scenario says. The objectives can be many and varied, so it might be to kill a specific monster that comes out, or it may be to destroy the opponent's castle, the monster's castle. It may simply be to survive for a certain period of time, or it may be that if you do not win by turn 11, you automatically lose. So depending on the scenario and depending on the difficulty you set, you must play differently, play smarter or play harder, in order to defeat that scenario and come out on top. Well, there you have it. That is Castle Assault, a game for 1 to 2 players by TJ Dunbar. Now, this game is a card game, obviously, but you're playing it out, and each of the factions is going to have a different feel, and each thing you do is going to have an effect on how the game's going to play out. The first thing you kind of have to decide is, one, which cards are you going to use as resources as opposed to using as units that you can put out into the field? Two, once you've got that decision made and you have resources and units out in your castle, are you going to rush forward, or are you just going to go with the kind of incremental move that happens each turn? There's either the more defensive strategy of kind of holding back, or the offensive strategy of running forward. And depending on which type of faction you're playing, this is of course going to vary. So each different faction in of its own has different abilities. And so, for example, the Wolves faction is going to be a little bit more hasty. The second they come out, they're able to do something, a lot of them, not all of them. But in addition to that, they're going to have an ability that lets them bring other wolves out onto the battlefield next to them. So not always summoning them in the castle, but bringing them out onto the battlefield and being able to better rush their opponent. The elves, on the other hand, are a little bit more ranged. They have ranged attacks and they can move laterally instead of always moving forward. So they may be a bit better at defense, holding back and killing things off as they come up to their castle to try and destroy it. Things like the vampires. The vampires are a weird and kind of interesting system to play because they are not very good defensively, and they aren't necessarily super strong offensively, but they do have the ability to heal if they are able to kill a unit without dying themselves. And sometimes they're able to regenerate based on having other guys out on the field. So there's a different feel depending on which faction you play. Of course, there's also the single-player mode, so if you don't always have someone to play against, there's that variety. And on top of that, there are several cards that you can use to customize your deck, some neutral faction cards that will give you different things that you can place in there in order to spice it up a little bit. So if that sounds good to you, check it out. That's Castle Assault, up on Kickstarter now, and I'm sure they'd be happy to have your support.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching the Dice Tower.